Is that okay? Testing, 1, 2, you can hear? Yeah. Okay. All right. Hello? Okay. Okay. Testing. Is that better? We're okay? Online okay too? Okay. So we're taking a little break from doing the regular Friday night Avatamsico lectures to explore a theme. This will be the second of 2 and possibly maybe a third talk on, and it's titled The Mountain and Me, but it's really an exploration of the uses of the natural world, the forests, the mountains, streams, oceans, as almost a dharma door, almost a portal to self-cultivation. And so last week we were blessed to have it at the Redwood Vihara in the mountains, in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This week we're back here in the Berkeley Mountains. And I say that because many of the terms for monasteries or viharas or hermitages in the Buddhist tradition at least were often conjoined with words like mountain, forest, grove, sort of. And so really, if you look at it, the forests and the mountains, and I'm using forest and mountains to talk about generally the whole natural landscape outside of most urban and suburban settings. These were the original monasteries, if you want to use that word. The word vihara, we talked about this last week, really meant a secluded place in which to walk, to discuss, to investigate, and also to be very quiet and listen to oneself. The buildings actually came later. But even when the buildings came, the original first monasteries or viharas, or sometimes called bodhimandas, they were often situated in mountains and forest in remote areas. So even though the first monasteries were really outdoors, they weren't any place at all, it's only when the rainy seasons came that viharas or temporary monasteries were set up to bring the monks and nuns together for that period of time, and then they began wandering again. So I used the expression last week that cultivators are sort of like backpackers, and it's really true. There's backpackers of the mountain, but these are backpackers of the mind. And the backpackers of the mind can use the mountains to do their practice and cultivation. So this is really interesting. The question comes up, why were the first monasteries really open air venues? And then even when the monasteries were established and became made of brick and stone and roofs and more elaborate, they were still primarily located in remote mountainous areas. And this is true across quite a few of the traditions, at least the ones I visited. When we stayed at had a session get together at the Trappist Monastery in Gethsemane, again, that monastery's roots going back to France was coming out of remote area situations, and even in there's just hundreds of acres of rolling hills and open space, far away from the cities. I think one of the reasons is that, at least in the Buddhist tradition, awakening, which is the primary sort of goal, often requires a kind of stopping, a halting, interrupting the dream, so to speak, because you're waking from a dream state. So the dream state is not just a dreaming as we think of at night, but it's a waking dream state generated by sort of our ordinary consciousness projecting a reality that we live in, and also the habituations that surround it. So it's a very tight woven imaginary fabricated world. And so the awakening often has to interrupt that, has to shake it up somehow. Sometimes it's shaken by external events, a near exposure to death or something like that, or a traumatic event, or a sudden loss, or a sudden profound insight where everything starts to turn almost 180 degrees. But it's often felt as if an abrupt turning or awakening from something that was half asleep or maybe more than half asleep. So many of these cultivators left this constructed or fabricated world to a more deconstructed as it is world closer to nature. It isn't to say that nature can't become another projection and attachment. It's certainly true. But to a large extent, the experience was in leaving behind the actual constructed centers of civilization with all of the lures of sights and sounds and smells, and this, it's almost like elaborate Disneylands, if you will. Most civilized centers are sort of like that. They're playgrounds for the six senses and for the consciousness that goes out and mixes and mingles. And so it's very easy to get drunk and dreaming in this. I mean, this Bay Area, you can hop in a car tonight and just go through Disneyland from one place to another, from bars and movies to who knows what else is going on, football games. But all this is a pretend magical construction of the mind. And so cultivators who really want to wake up to something as it is, as opposed to as we imagine it or as we construct it, will often go closer to nature. And what this nature allows, I will even say it insists, if you really lose yourself in a close experience with nature, it insists that we stop and reset. As with meditation, the technique of zhiguan, stopping and contemplating, which is a Buddhist meditation technique, involves this stopping. Of course, it means stopping the outflowing unprecepted existence and starting to discipline your body and your mind. That's the stopping. And from that stopping, a kind of calm can develop that leads to contemplative insight. So you could see that, in a sense, the going into some place like the woods, or say going to one of the viharas or one of the mountain temples, you're stopping the ordinary flow of what we do day to day, and then you're quietly, because nature facilitates this, observing, immersing, and seeing differently. And then, at least in this tradition, and in the tradition, if I wanted to talk a little bit about the Buddha's, Shakyamuni Buddha Siddhartha Gautama's experience, there is a re-entry back into the fabricated, constructed world. So this completes a cycle. You're in it, you're immersed in it, you're drunk and dreaming in it, you pull away to reset, to change, to, in a sense, create a new person and a new mind. And then, interestingly, you can see this in many artistic renderings too. There's a return in the famous woodblock, ox herding woodblock series. You can see the young lad is going after awakening, represented allegorically as this kind of untamed ox. And it takes a couple of woodcuts where he doesn't even know where the ox is, and he sees the tail, then he finally sees the ox. And it goes through a series where finally he's able to subdue, tame, and then sit on top of the ox, meaning he's conquered and overcome his passions and afflictions. But the last scene is he's returning back into the city, riding on top of the ox, moving out of the forest back into the city to teach and transform and share. So this cycle happens too with, and I think I was thinking of the people who came or listened last week were maybe also had listened or watched the Ted Berger movie. And as I was talking to some people about this, they said the maximum time is sort of like 5 to 6 or 7 years that the hermits go into the mountains and do this, and then they come back into either their major way places or back into, quote, civilization. So it's not necessarily a permanent existence. There's something about then the air. They talk about the air, the atmosphere. The trees themselves play a big part, as does the water that collects and flows through the space. So I just want to share one poem. Last week, I did the poem from Li Bai or Li Bo on The Mountain and Me, where the talk comes from. We sit together, the mountain and me, and not until only the mountain remains, that poem. This is another one by him. In this case, he's talking about the connection between the creek that's flowing through this forest, called Clear Creek, and that's the title of the poem. It's actually called Clear Creek Chant or Song. And he basically extols the virtues of the creek as both a metaphor for his own mind, but also a mirror. And so it just goes like this. I want to share some of the poetry as I go along with this, because I think it's really graphic. His poem is It, meaning Clear Creek. It renders the mind clear, Clear Creek. Its water unrivaled for such pure color. I gaze into the bottom of it. It's always fresh repose. I gaze into the bottom of its always fresh repose. Is there anything like this? Brilliant mirror in which people walk? So he's talking about using the creek as a reflective stimulus almost for his own purity and clarity. And he's saying, is there anything like this brilliant mirror in which people walk? And again, you have the walking metaphor that the vihara is a place to walk and contemplate as one's walking. And this next line, it's wonderful. It's a wind painting. Birds cross through. It's a wind painting that birds cross through. And the birds flying over are reflected, and it's the wind on top. You can just visualize this connectivity. And at nightfall, shrieking monkeys leave, all lament over distant, empty wandering. So this is another poem by Li Po, used as a stimulus or as a kind of reflective device when looking at elements of nature. For me, when I'm up in Maine, it isn't shrieking monkeys. There aren't any shrieking monkeys in Maine, but there are loons. And so at night, at nightfall, the crying loons all lament and distant wandering entering. And particularly the sound of the loon is a very haunting, solitary sound. And it breaks through the silence of the night. It's almost as if the only sound you hear at night, all of a sudden in this darkness when you're asleep or half asleep, is this whoo, and then it just dies away. And it's a wonderful kind of real, very real sound. It's nothing artificial. It's not made by people. It's not broadcast. And it's never the same. And just that silence being pierced by that sound is a kind of meditative state. I don't know how to describe it. In any event, I want to go on and maybe talk some more. So using the backpacking image, and again, the Dhutanga practices, especially the 13 Dhutanga practice of the forest monks, was to carry all their possessions on their back as they moved, which discouraged accumulation unless you're really strong. But there's a point that even the strongest can't carry more than 50 or 60 pounds for a long period of time. And theirs was very simple. But while they were reducing their load of material things, they were increasing their mindfulness of the interior realm. And they, as I was saying, they were backpackers of the mind. So they were exploring what are called the 18 realms. And the 18 realms is basically the description, the Buddhist description of the sense organs or the sense faculties and the sense objects and the consciousness that bring them together. So there's eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and then mind or mana, chitta. These are the 6 faculties. And there's a corresponding sight and sound and smell, tangible or kinesthetic, and then dharmas are the things that are connected with more the mental aspect, of mental interior fabrications of mind. And then the 8 consciousnesses, the 6 consciousnesses that link them. And so these make up what the 18 realms. And so this is what's called understanding the mind in all its states. And so this is the terrain that backpackers of the mind explore. And the equipment they have is very different. It's not material equipment per se. Basically, there's said to be 3 things needed to do this: Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. So they take the 3 non-outflow study techniques and use these and the paramitas to explore their mind. And as a process of what they're doing, they're jettisoning unnecessary baggage, which are called the klesha, the afflictions, as they do this. The sutras are absolutely important in this process. Trying to cultivate this hermit-like seclusion, solitude, without the guidance of the deep text, the deep theory, is very easy to get lost. It's very easy to just fall in states of wandering consciousness. So that's a kind of way of looking at the backpacking of the mind. The other thing about nature is it's almost as if it's a companion. When you saw the movie, you saw these hermits. They were talking about nature, the mountains, the forest, as almost as they were their companions, their fellow cultivators. The thing about it, though, is, and I mentioned this last week, when you're deeply in nature alone, especially, there's no judging that nature does. There's no scolding. There's no soliciting. Nature doesn't hit on you and try to, draw you in. But the other thing is, it doesn't flatter either, and it doesn't pamper, and doesn't get infatuated with you. So it can be a great teacher of anatta, not self. But the thing is that nature really doesn't teach. I mean, that's giving it far too much intentionality. Nature, in a sense, does nothing. It just does nothing. It doesn't even give the truth. It only sort of stops the false. It brings you into as it is, and it stops the false. So in that way, it can be a mirror, but only if you're willing to stop and look into this mirror. In Maine, where I spend a good part of my summer, I'd like to spend more. For most people, nature is not a mirror, it's a TV screen for the people that come up there. It's an extension of me and mind rather than a stopping of me and mind. It's not a counterpoint, in other words, to the ego. It actually becomes, sadly, an extension of the ego. It's actually more common for me, and I observe it up there, except for a few people, Most people just use that nature because I think they're kind of a little frightened by the openness and the vulnerability that nature provides, the kind of deep emptiness, especially with no massive civilized entertainment and diversions. So people rev up their egos in nature. It's very interesting to watch. They try to conquer it with extreme sports. What I call they condo it. They built all these elaborate condos and hot tubs, and then try to satellite in widescreen TV connections and so forth. So it's really funny. I can be out kayaking and pass what seems to be a remote camp or cottage, and all of a sudden you see the flicker and flare of the TV screen. You're like, well, there's no electric. Well, they're using battery operated and then satellite connections to bring this in. So right in the middle of nature, they are escaping from its very presence. People then get all kinds of hot machines, like hot boats and hot ski things. What are these things called? Jet skis, yeah, jet skis. Even helicopters and hydroplanes. And then every summer they have this race with souped up race cars that actually using combinations of almost rocket fuel to get up to 60, 80, 120 miles on these back roads to have races. It's crazy, and they do it, and then you can hear it. You can see all the smoke flying, then you hear helicopter siren and ambulance to pick somebody up who crashed the car going into a corner, and all the animals just disappear for that day, and then when it's all done, everything comes back and nature reclaims the road again. But that's what they're up there for. They don't stop and contemplate. They're not observing anything, the creek or the mirror, anything. They're just racing through, and then they go to the local tavern and get drunk and go to the next mountain and do this again. So instead of escaping themselves, they actually inflate themselves. But again, the wonderful thing about nature is it's like in the Avatamsaka that describes the great ocean has this capacity to embrace and accept all things without rejecting anything. It's called this sea-like patience. Nature in the woods and the forest is also like this. It doesn't really care if you get enlightened. It's not there to be a Shanjersha, and it doesn't care if you have a good time or not. And it doesn't care if you bow to it or if you curse it. It's truly thus unmoving. So I just want to bring that up again, unless we sort of mystify nature as being something really esoterically mysterious and full of magical wonders. It could be seen that way through the eyes of a certain experience, but nature itself doesn't present that. It's just basically this space where there's none of the climbing and manipulations and the confusion that associate with the human. So on one hand, it's very refreshing, but for other experiences of it, it can also be very scary or frightening. Because it's very hard to set up an identity in that space. Nothing in nature invites that. And in fact, it pushes against it. But if you really think about it, this is part of the unsettling that nature can do to wake up us from the dream. So most of our views and most of our settled identities have to do with taking the six sense organs and attaching them to these six sense objects, creating an artificial consciousness that holds that together, and then resisting the natural elements of impermanence and non-self that push on that. And so what nature does, it really ups the ante for hitting at our facade, hitting at our pretensions. There's a wonderful passage, I'll just share the first part of it from the Tao Te Ching. Because I could almost put this up, I would like to put this up on a sign in these back roads at Maine for all these people coming through with their motorcycles and their fast cars and so on. Those that would gain what is under heaven by tampering with it, I have seen that they do not succeed. For that which is under heaven is like a holy vessel, dangerous to tamper with. Those who tamper with it harm it. Those that grab it lose it. This is from the Tao Te Ching. Also, a really useful work one that I took with me on my early backpacking, solo backpacking trips was the Tao Te Ching. And I would, read it at the end of the day or early in the morning, read a passage, and it really somehow flows in and brings out this connection with nature and the Dharma and the Tao. Really a good portal. And then I want to share one more poem with you. This is from the Western side, from an American poet who, in her writing and her exposure to nature, and she spent most of her life living in remote places of Maine and the East Coast, near the shores. She's in the spirit of Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, our nature poets. But this is Mary Oliver, but contemporary. She just died a few years ago. This one, she's talking how much knowledge she had of Buddhism, I don't know. Being an educated woman of the 21st century, it'd be rare that she didn't have some access to this. However, all of her writing comes from her heart and from her direct encounter, almost with a childlike presence of nature itself. And she finds this no self element built into the experience with nature. So I'll read you this poem. It's really quite wonderful and fits our theme. I thought the earth remembered me. That's how the poem starts. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the riverbed. Nothing between me and the white fire of stars, but my thoughts. And they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. Now remember the poetry I was reading from the Chinese tradition. The clouds have vanished in the sky, and now the birds have vanished into the sky, and now the last cloud drains away. This idea of comparing thoughts, she says, to the moths, as light moths floating into the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. A luminous doom. This is oxymoron. A luminous doom. I take this to mean, as the next clients will conclude, that she was in a sense dying. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times. And the last line, into something better. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. And this poem, the title of this poem is Sleeping in the Forest. So just share that this is really quite interesting how it really cuts across time and traditions. But in our own way, you could take this as almost a matching to the early Li Bo or Li Bai poem from the Chinese side. So this one line I want to quote from, this is one of the hermit monks in the Ted Berger movie from the Jungnan Mountain. And he says basically, if you understand the practice, then in the mountains you can thrive. But if you don't understand the practice, you can go astray here. And I put my own parentheses, or anywhere. In other words, he's saying if you understand the practice in the mountains, you can be centered and thrive. If you don't understand the practice, you can go astray here. But I would say if you don't understand the practice, you can go astray anywhere. The mountains are a good place to practice, he continues. Until you awaken, you can rely on this environment to help you do the practice, not as a substitute for the practice. So this is the key, that the mountains become a stimulus to guide and inspire the practice, but they don't replace it. Just sitting in nature, not cultivating one's mind and getting rid of klesha, is not going to bring this kind of liberated awakening. That's why in the text it says this direct mind, the straight mind, the direct mind is the place of awakening. So, no matter how idyllic or adverse the natural world is, it's still Wai-Dao, it's still externalist. But you can use that in a particular way to actually go within, to cultivate within. So, if I'm going, the way places, the word is Bodhimanda, which is literally place of awakening. I mentioned last week, these are often, in the Chinese tradition at least, called mountains or forest. So there's Wutaishan, there's Putoshan, there's Omeishan, there's Zhouhuashan. These are all famous mountain monastery way places. But there's also the Lin, like Baolin and Shaolin and so forth. So I was thinking, ours is redwood. So it's a redwood bihar, redwood forest. What's really interesting in this, as I started to think about this, and this would be a bit of a digression, but I think it's really interesting, how much the natural world, and trees figure in early accounts of the Buddha's life. This is really interesting. Today I was reading over the Bodhicharita, which is the life of the Buddha written by Ashvaghosha. And I was blown away when you read it, how much imagery and description and picture comes out from nature. The woods, the trees, the forest, the sun, the moon, the fields. It's almost as if this is pre-modern in a sense. You'd have to think, were there no cities and towns? Clearly there were, but the emphasis on this path to awakening pursued by the Buddha is rich with allusions to nature and the natural world. All the major events in the Buddha's life, if I calculate right, took place under trees. This is really interesting. Okay, so he's born under what's called the Shala tree, Sharia robusta in Latin, if you want it. And it said his mother, ready to give birth, reached up and grabbed a branch with her right hand. And the text says, clinging to the bough of the tree laden with flowers, the young Buddha emerges from the womb. So he gives birth under the Shala tree. He experienced his first deep meditation state as a young man, actually kind of an adolescent. Without instructions from any teachers, he entered the first deep stage of meditation under the rose apple tree. It's very interesting. And later, when he was cultivating the ascetic practices and he was coming up against the difficulties of pushing asceticism to the extreme, trying to get a breakthrough, really working hard. He was called the patient immortal because you see his bones and flesh, thinking he could get liberated by the renunciation of the flesh. And he pushed and pushed it. Suddenly this memory came back to him of the rose apple tree and how naturally as a kid he just sat under that tree and lost himself in this contemplative immersion that brought great joy and liberation to him. And he backed away from that bitter asceticism at that point on the memory of that and then began to pursue what he called the middle way. So you have his birth, you have his first experience with the apple tree. Then he goes off and he lives in what's called the ascetic grove. So when he renounces the palace, he goes into the forest, this ascetic grove of trees. And in fact, throughout this text, the recurring phrase that happens is he abandons the palace and enters the forest. And it's enters the forest, enters the forest, enter the forest. And he even says at some point, I won't leave the forest. Once I've entered the forest, I won't go back any more than a man saved from a burning house would go back to a burning house. But the forest is both, I think here, literal and also figurative. So this use of the forest is that which is unencumbered by so many things and can be a possibility for freeing from attachments is here. And then later, of course, his profound awakening on Uttara Samyak Sambodhi occurs under the Bodhi tree. Wow. It's actually called Fica religiosa, which is a variation of a fig tree. So whether you call it, sometimes people use the word, I think, Bodhi tree, Pipala tree, Peepul tree. These are all different words for the same tree, basically. Sometimes banyan, which is another variety of this fig-related species. So that's where he has his awakening. And then after he has that, he wanders. And again, as he's wandering, there's all these expressions of gathering together under trees. In the Jada Grove, which is like a park, a garden. And then at the end of his life, when he's passing away, where does he pass away? Lying between two mighty trees. Again, shala trees like the one he was born under. I mean, this is really interesting. I'll share you this selection here. This is from his rose apple tree experience. And I'm quoting from, this is from the life of the Buddha. I thought of a time when my Shakyan father was working and I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, quite secluded from sensual desires, secluded from unwholesome things. I'd entered upon the first abode of meditation, which is accompanied by thinking and exploring with happiness and pleasure born of seclusion. And this joy that he experienced at this came from this relaxed contemplation. It was pleasurable. Now, I want to be very clear about this. It's not outflowing pleasure, but this is closer to something in Sanskrit, which is called rasa, which is this sublime, whole fulfillment of your being that doesn't have a beginning or end, but rather, and it's intrinsic. It is not it's not brought about through something external necessarily at all. It's a very different than, say, trishna, thirst, and kama in these terms. It's something much more rich and much more whole. And in the midst of this, sitting under the rose apple tree, he had discovered something he had lost as he got older, which he called just the simple happiness of being content with no desires and nothing pressing on him. And suddenly that thought came flooding back to him. And he thought to himself, this was later, he thought, might this be the way to enlightenment? Not these bitter asceticism, this mortifying practices, but, and it was almost incredulous to him that it was so simple. Then it says, following up in that memory, there came to him recognition that this was the way to enlightenment. And recognizing that it was indeed, he continued his investigation. And so what's described here is under the tree, in the simpleness of freedom from desires, he discovered this joy and pleasure of letting go to a kind of openness that has nothing to do with seeking, craving, hustling, or even with the self. So this is a really interesting account. And you could say, well, maybe it's just coincidence that the trees figure so prominently. I don't think it is. I think we have to look at this a little more carefully, and I think there's something here. We are so now out of touch with nature that we find this to be rather strange. But I think in his time, his spiritual gateway away from the inner desires and afflictions, and also the externals that pressed upon that, the palace and all that, came through deeply going into the natural world. And in the natural world, he discovered his own nature again. Not just nature itself, but through that, his own nature. The present link to that tree is right now in a place called Bodh Gaya in India, where Buddha is said to attain this enlightenment. And it's probably a direct descendant of the original tree, because they took cuttings and passed them along. The time goes so quickly, I just touched on a few things tonight. So let me go back to this awakening, this direct awakening. A tree is not going to give it to you. Okay, I'm going back to this, the why Tao. If you think, if I go sit under that tree in Bodh Gaya, wow, I'll have the same awakening the Buddha had. And then you leave you say, redwood trees can't do it. I got to go to a Bodhi tree. And so here's a story that I'll close with tonight, and then we'll pick this up next week, because obviously there's so much more we can talk about. When we were traveling as monks in India, we went to a lot of the famous places, Vulture Peak and so forth. But you know, I was really thinking, I want to go to Bodh Gaya and sit under the Bodhi tree. Well, you go to Bodh Gaya and it's open for visitors and tourists during the day, but it's like a circus almost. There's just so many people. It's not a contemplative, quiet space. And so I thought, oh, bummer. And then, because we were monks, we talked to the monk there, and I said, oh yeah, okay. So, well, after everybody goes tonight, when it gets dark, you guys can come back and sit under the Bodhi tree. I thought, oh, wonderful. I'm gonna get it. Tonight, when everybody's gone, it's really quiet. We're gonna get. So at night, coming back, we enter. Well, we weren't the only monks in the area. So, a lot of monks had been able to come in at night, which was okay, because there was Theravada monks there sitting in meditation, and I put down my cloth to sit in meditation. But there were also a great deal, a delegation of Tibetan Buddhist monks there. And so I crossed, and I thought, okay, the star at night under the Bodhi tree. What? They had these long horns. I mean, these really long horns that you see in the Alps and whatnot, and then the other one, and there, clang, clang, bang, bang, and then a Tibetan monk got beside me and laid down this wooden paddle. I thought, what is he doing? And he put on his mittens with leather on the bottom, and he was doing prostrations, like on a shuffleboard, but just like boom, boom, back. So full prostration, and I'm sitting there, boom, back, bang, boom. This went on until 3 in the morning, until it was all over. And part of me just laughed and thought, okay, you know, this is the world, this is what it's like, even under the Bodhi tree. But then I also thought, what did I think that something magical was going to happen under the Bodhi tree, other than the same old thing of recognizing and controlling and subduing my mind? And so I was just coming back that if the mind, going back to what that monk said, if you understand how to practice, then the forest can be. And if you really understand to practice, then even a full concert under the Bodhi tree is still a good place. But if you don't understand how to practice, even if I'd been the only person that night, my wish to get awakened under the magic elements of the Bodhi tree would have been the obstruction to my actual awakening. Because awakening isn't something you get, it's something you become by letting go of all desires and seeking. So my desires and seeking I brought with me. In a sense, they were just pointing out, because I was getting pissed off, right? And it's like, wait a minute, why am I getting, because they're interrupting my awakening. And it's like, totally off. So I'll stop there for tonight. It was just a story to share. And then if there's still some interest, I'll pick up on these and continue these the next couple, because there's so much more I want to go over. And it's very rich. I found out it was quite rich. So, any event. Okay. By the way, in case you didn't notice, we are back at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery. So, do you need the microphone?
So maybe tell me when you got ready and we can put it at the same time.
Smartphone connected.
Yeah, I'm going to use my laptop to do it.
You use your laptop to do it?
Yeah, on Zoom.
I'm not understand how you're gonna do it. Where's the power on?
very shortly described what happened here. House okay, garage gone. Same like track. You can see how close fire was. So we are here in the second house. Or in the first house, actually. We'll continue lecturing on Avatamsaka Sutra. It's you can find a transmission online on our Dharma Realm channel. Otherwise,
Okay, we can dedicate.
mhm.
Okay. So we can do our dedication of merit. Yeah, again. Okay. Oh, the camera stopped? Oh, okay. May every living beings, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise.
Bow in respect to the three jewels.